So, over the past decade, the most common injury prevention model used was the Michelin four-stage model for injury prevention. Now, the problem with the Michelin stage approach is that a lot of times we have trouble as a profession or as a research society making it past its second stage. We do a good job of identifying problems, looking at the mechanisms of how they happen, but then we don't really look at how we can introduce these preventative measures to get these injuries or the prevalence of injuries to lower themselves. So that's where the TRIPP model comes into play. Now, the TRIPP model is a six-stage model. It's an awesome approach to actually figuring out an efficient and effective way of implementing a new prevention practice. So, or a new prevention strategy for injuries. So the TRIPP model, it stands for, I believe, translating the research into injury prevention practice. So with the six stages, the first stage looks at injury surveillance, and these first two or three stages, um, they look a whole lot like the Michelin model. The first stage being injury surveillance. So at this stage, you're kind of looking around and you're looking at the prevalence of injuries. You're looking at how many injuries are occurring in football, how many injuries are occurring, or how many concussions are occurring in football, how many ankle sprains or ACL sprains are occurring in soccer, stuff like that. So we need this big body of evidence so that we can determine where to start. We need to figure out where we need to make these prevention strategies and where we need to reduce the amount of injuries occurring, starting off with this stage one. Stage two, it's looking at the etiology and the mechanisms of injury. So what that means is it's looking at, for concussions, let's say, is it looking at helmet to helmet in football? Is it looking at helmet to shoulder in football? Is it looking at a whiplash injury or a helmet to hitting the ground? You need to understand the mechanism of how this happens before you can start looking at what type of prevention that you can use. So another example, if you're looking at ACLs in soccer, was it contact from another player? Was it a twisting mechanism? Was it a slowing down and turning mechanism? Anything along those lines. So the third stage looks at developing actual preventative measures. So, so for example, if we're looking at, let's say, um, a conditioning program for soccer players before they go into their soccer season and seeing if that helps to reduce the amount of ACL injuries. Now that would be time consuming. So before we can do that, we need to prove that this is something that could work. So you're going to move on to stage four with stage three in mind. Now, stage four looks at creating a small group or a case study or a cohort study, and it implements that prevention measure and it sees if it's effective. Now, if it's effective, then we can go ahead and move into stage five. Now, stage five is where you want to, figure out what the best way of implementing this prevention strategy is. So, if you have this conditioning program and you have a 6-week conditioning program, that's what you studied, that's what worked, then you want to look and see if you can implement that. Now, let's say that you go and you talk to athletes, you talk to coaches, you talk to the governing bodies of the sport, and you say, is this probable? If they say no, it's too time consuming. We don't have the staff. It's too much money. We need to be able to amend and kind of change your prevention strategy so that you can still use it, but it's something that can actually get implemented. This is a big change with the TRIPP model when compared to the Michelin model. The Michelin model is, they found this 6-week study, of conditioning, and then that translated to a reduction in the amount of ACL injuries. If that didn't work with the Michelin stage, then it was back to square one. With this, you're looking at stage 5 in the TRIPP model, and you say, okay, maybe I can make it a 4-week model, and maybe I can reduce the amount of initial conditioning that they're having to do, but we can get them to do something. Maybe just focusing on proprioception, just focusing on strengthening, or just focusing on looking at the muscular imbalances that are associated with their athletes. changing that prevention strategy so that it can be implemented. Um, so this is where we look into stage 6. We've got our amended strategy. We've implemented it. It's been accepted by the players, the coaches, the governing body, by ATs, by the physicians. It's been accepted. Now let's look at the um, newly made prevention strategy. Let's look at its effectiveness. So these 6 stages, I feel like, are game changers. Um, Compared to the mesh model, this really looks at how we can efficiently and effectively introduce prevention strategies. Just because they're not the exact strategy that we found in our small control, it's something that we were actually able to, implement. And it was, for the lack of a better word, it was probable. So I definitely think that the TRIPP model is something that I'm going to look into as a clinician and as a researcher, and that's how I would look into implementing prevention strategies into my practice.